Can Daggerheart rescue your Dungeons and Dragons game? Today on RPG Boons.
Help me, Rod. Help me. Help you.
I think the question I really want to pose is, what are RPG systems good for?
Riddle me this, riddle me that.
Whether it be Dungeons and Dragons, Pathfinder, Dungeon Crawl Classics, or the new Daggerheart, or maybe the up-and-coming MCDM Productions RPG system.
I don't know where to start.
Essentially, RPG systems are for conflict resolution. You present a situation, and without you trying to give too much bias, you allow chance to take over and determine whether or not things go their way or they don't.
Natural one.
So what we're going to do today on RPG Boons is we're going to make a quick comparison of Daggerheart and Dungeons and Dragons. Let's talk about the real thing that matters in the game.
And nothing else matters.
How is conflict resolved in Daggerheart versus Dungeons and Dragons? I'm not focusing too much on Dungeons and Dragons because the assumption is you guys already know how 5e works. But let's start looking at Daggerheart here. You probably have already heard that Daggerheart is using a 2d12 system for the players. Meanwhile, the GM still has to roll a 1d20. What does this tell you immediately about the game? That the odds are favored towards the players. Players can roll up to a 24, where the DM can roll up to just a 20 with their standard rolling dice. Now, when it comes to how hard something is to complete, they both have target numbers. In the case of Dungeons & Dragons, it's armor class or difficulty class. In Daggerheart, they're calling it difficulty class for just about everything against the monsters or what the players have to do. However, the heroes have an evasion score, which works very similar to armor class, but only the heroes have an evasion score. For all the GM's monsters have a DC score associated with them. And they also have the same difficulty types: easy, medium, hard, very hard, and impossible, or whatever it is, extremely impossible. And then on top of those rolls, you can get certain types of bonuses in both games, right? In Dungeons & Dragons, you have the ability scores that provide those bonuses, you have proficiencies, and then in certain circumstances, you have advantages and disadvantages. Remember rolling those 2 dice. And then there's also buffs, right? There's bards that can give you inspiration, clerics that can give you guidance, things like that. In Daggerheart, they have very similar things. They're calling them traits, they're calling them experiences. Experiences is a very broad word for the types of things that you know, but you get bonuses with that. They also have advantage and disadvantage, which essentially is a plus 1d6 or minus 1d6 to a roll. They also have buffs. There's assisting, there's cooperation, there's other heroes that can provide you bonuses to your rolls as well. Now, I think the one thing that's pretty cool about the game, the idea of hope and fear dice. When you think about a hope dice, it's actually more like a hero action point dice. And when you think about the fear dice, it's more like a GM action point die. Okay, the idea being is you use these 2d12s to target a number, right? It's just like Dungeons and Dragons. We're gonna put a DC 15 on that. And depending on what you roll the highest on, either the hope die or the fear die, aka the hero die or the GM die, depending on which die was highest, you get an added benefit to that. So in the top example, we're looking at a 7 and a 12, that's a 19, but you rolled with fear. That means that the GM gets a point or a GM point that he can use, and on top of that, your turn ends. If you get a 7 and a 10, and your hope die was a 10, and you still get a 17, right? So you defeat that DC 15, but now you get a hope point, right? So you get a hero action point, and you can continue to do actions if you feel like you want to. Then there's the critical success, which works just like Dungeons and Dragons, where you get to max out all your damage for that attack. Now, the interesting thing about this is the hope and fear dice. Dungeons and Dragons already has a very similar mechanism, and that's inspiration. The problem with inspiration is it's really dependent on the DM to decide who he's going to give inspiration to. You roleplayed really well, you were key to the adventure, and so you get an inspiration point. You don't get an inspiration point. But what this does here in Daggerheart is essentially they leave it up to the dice to decide who's going to get the action points. Awesome. That means the DM doesn't have to play favorites, or the GM rather doesn't have to play favorites, and you don't have to feel like the GM is playing favorites. It's really up to the dice and what you roll that determines whether or not you're going to get action points. How does taking turns work in Daggerheart versus Dungeons and Dragons? In Dungeons and Dragons, we already know it's whoever rolls the highest goes first, and then depending on who rolled what, you just basically go by order. In Daggerheart, there is no initiative system. The group decides how you want to do things in order. Now, again, I still think that this is playing a little bit to the heroes. Not only are they rolling 2d12 to get a high 24 die roll when they're doing that, but you get to decide which heroes get to go first, really benefiting the heroes more than the DM or the GM. Again, this is pushing towards giving heroes more power, but I think some people will agree with that, while others may not. Remember, old school versus new school. If you haven't seen the video, go check it out. Another cool part about the initiative system, at least as it pertains to the GM or the Dungeon Master, is that they get to take their turn as soon as the players fail. So normally in Dungeons & Dragons, let's say you roll a 4 or a 5 for your initiative order, well, what happens is all these heroes can wipe out your villain immediately, within seconds, right? How many times have you heard a group of heroes knocks out that big bad, the BBEG, really quick? Well, now, as soon as that first hero makes a fear roll, or fails a die roll, GM gets to take their turn. And on top of that, they can themselves also execute different types of maneuvers using those GM points that they gained either from fear that your players may have given them throughout the rolling process. So I think this is really cool. It really mixes it up. It adds a lot more dynamics to the gameplay. And as you're doing these rolls, you can build up these action points for your heroes, but also, unfortunately, for the GM.
You shall pay for it! Holy shit!
Now that we understand the basic mechanics of combat, let's look at the damage system. Since armor is the one thing that's going to protect you from getting damaged, let's take a look at how that works first. In Dungeons & Dragons, pick an armor such as plate mail, and you get an AC of 18, and if somebody rolls between a 10 and a 17 towards you, it is implied in the roll that that armor deflects the damage. But essentially rolling from a 10 and a 17 hits the armor, and you don't have to worry about armor after that. In Daggerheart, armor functions as a damage reduction. So you can see here, looking at full plate armor, it has an armor score of 9. That means anytime your hero takes damage, you can reduce it by 9. However, when you think about those hit points, it works a little bit different in Daggerheart compared to Dungeons & Dragons. In Dungeons & Dragons, every hit point and every point of damage matters. You have to calculate it, you have to watch it, you have to keep track of it. But in Daggerheart, there's only 6 to 12 hit points you have to track. You still roll for damage, but you have to get through these thresholds. In this case, I'm showing an example of 5, 10, and 15, which this is numbers that I just made up. But essentially, if you roll between a 5 and a 10, you do 1 hit point damage, 10 to a 15, you do 2 hit points of damage, and if you do a 15 or higher, you take 3 points of damage. And then you can use that armor to reduce the number of damage that you take in, and thereby reducing the number of hit points you're going to take in Daggerheart. In addition, they included this other attribute called stress, which essentially to me sounds like endurance. Stress right here represents the mental and physical strain put on your character during their adventure. To me, that sounds like endurance, and this is just an extra factor that they've included in Daggerheart. I should also mention that when that rolled damage is less than whatever your minimum threshold is, you take a point of stress. And there's an example here. If you lose 5 stress points, you essentially take 1 hit point of damage. And so here what we're looking at is just examples of using those numbers. Remember, we talked about that evasion score, which is essentially a hero's armor class. Only heroes have that. Now, these evasion scores basically work like a dexterity modifier in Dungeons & Dragons. When the DM rolls to hit and he rolls to less than that number, you're essentially able to dodge the attack. You can see a Bard and a Guardian have 2 different types of evasion scores, the Bard being more swiftly, the Guardian being less swiftly. And then you can see these damage thresholds. For the Bard, it's 3, 8, 13, while it's clearly higher for the Guardian at 6, 11, and 16. So what about combat distances? You know, Daggerheart has its own way of measuring distances. They really simplify the combat distances. What you can see here is that they're going to give you 5 basic distances: melee, very close, close, far, and very far. So you really don't have to spend a lot of time thinking about those distances. You can just broadly say where you think the enemies are. This will really help you have theater of the mind, so you don't have to worry and exactly track all those numbers. But if you like really crunchiness, they do provide some numbers and feed to associate with those distances so that you can use them if you want to use them. And as you guys know, in Dungeons & Dragons, everything is pre-written down, so you know exactly the range of those weapons. Most of the time in Dungeons & Dragons, the only people who can use short rests are people such as the Warlock to get their spell slots back, or a fighter who wants to get some of his, who wants to get that action surge back. But in Daggerheart, you can use these short rests to actually do something. Every single player has an opportunity to do something, so you feel a little more useful when you're doing those short rests. In addition, there's long rests. Again, it gives every single player something to do. You can fix your armor, you can clear some stress, you can tend to your wounds. This is awesome. Now, truth be told, in Dungeons & Dragons in Chapter 8, there is a portion about the long rest. There's an entire section about downtime, and it has something similar to this, but clearly Daggerheart has put a much better mechanic together for these short rests and long rests for the players, really making it useful for all of them. Do I need new dice to play Daggerheart? And the answer is no. If you very quickly look at this chart, we can see on the bottom right here, there's a D4, D6, D8, D10. And if you go online and get this free sample packet, you'll see there's also even a weapon that does 1 D20. One thing that really stands out, if you look at these damages, let's look at this battle axe. It does 1 D10 plus 2, okay. But if you look at a dagger, it does D8. Okay, so right away, we see there is going to be a little bit differences in the way damage is calculated, essentially saying that you can use a dagger just as good as someone can use a battle axe. I don't know. There has been some question of how many dice do I actually need to play Daggerheart. And people are a little bit, maybe some people are worried about it. Maybe it's just me. Okay, maybe it's just me. So one thing we're gonna do right now is we're gonna take a step back and look at character creation. Right here in Daggerheart, they list 14 different steps. Okay, if you look at Dungeons and Dragons, that very first chapter, there's 6 steps. But if you include chapter 4, where there's some backgrounds and you can create some ideals, bonds, and flaws, we're gonna looking at closer to maybe 8 to 9 more steps for that Dungeons and Dragons character creation. And if you look at some of these steps for Daggerheart, are actually information you pull directly off of the character sheets, so it's actually not that many steps when you really think about it. And when you think about Dungeons and Dragons, a lot of these steps are actually included in part of the character racial traits, as well as some of the class traits when you actually start building that character as well. So they might be actually comparable to each other. Now in Dungeons and Dragons, we have ability scores, right? We have strength, wisdom, and so forth. In Daggerheart, they have essentially the same 6 different ability scores, but they're calling them character traits. Now, the one thing that really stands out is instead of having just dexterity, they separated it into agility, which is whole body fast movement, and finesse, which is kind of more fine movement with your hands, which is essentially is the true definition of dexterity. And Constitution seems to be missing. When it comes to giving those ability scores or character traits, distributing those points to those character traits, it works very similar to the Dungeons & Dragons standard array. I have that listed on the right, 15, 14, 13, 12, 10, 8. And then character traits, they give you a +2, +1, +1, 0, 0, -1. I still don't understand why we have to have negatives for our heroes, but that is something I'll be discussing in another video. Let's talk about races, okay? In Daggerheart, they call them ancestries. And then on top of ancestries, you can add a community. Now this is very interesting. In Dungeons & Dragons, when you're a dwarf, if you went and saw that Tasha's video, when you're a dwarf, you come from certain types of backgrounds. If you're a mountain dwarf, you get certain kinds of traits. If you're a hill dwarf, you get certain kinds of traits. And then some things are just inherent about dwarves. If you read the descriptions in the beginning of the dwarves, it tells you a lot about where do dwarves come from. Now, I think this is kind of brilliant when it comes to Daggerheart. A lot of times, especially in that Tasha video, I had a few people tell me, what if I want to be a dwarf that grew up in the city? In Daggerheart, they essentially allow you to do this. They created ancestry, which is essentially something that's inherent about those races, maybe genetics involved or something. And then they created community. So now you can be a dwarf that either lived in the mountains with all the other dwarves, or you can be a dwarf that was a pirate, was highborn in a high society, or you were actually from the mountains or the hills. So it really gives a lot more flexibility for those races, which I think is something that Tasha was trying to do. But now they give it to you here. So in Daggerheart, at least, that standard way of life, the standard dwarves that we think about when we think about Lord of the Rings, do not really exist in Daggerheart, or at least you don't have to play them that way. Classes. You can see here on the left, Daggerheart has 9 classes and 2 domains with every single one of those classes, essentially subclasses. In Dungeons & Dragons, the very basics are 12 classes, each of those with having around 2 to 3 different subclasses that you can play. In addition, both have multi-classing. So at least at the moment, Dungeons & Dragons seems to have a little bit more versatility or a little bit more classes that you can play compared to Daggerheart. However, I think simplifying it is a much better way to go when it comes to Daggerheart. You know, one thing that stands out about Daggerheart is they actually have these cards that you use to help guide you with your domains / subclasses. I've seen some people out there in the YouTube world or the YouTube channel world kind of bringing this up as a negative thing, or it seems a little cumbersome, but I just want to point out something. Maybe it's just me, but I have some cards. My point is I don't think this is a big deal. D&D already has a bunch of cards that you can buy. They have all the spells listed on them. I didn't bother getting all the martial class cards just because I wasn't really using them. Having domain cards that you can look at to reference for skills that you might have, not a big deal. Now, it's really up to you which system you want to play. Clearly, Daggerheart has made a huge effort to make things a little more dynamic, and as I mentioned, I really like that short rest and long rest, giving your players something to do. I also like those hero points and DM points like that you can roll based on that hope and fear dice. So I think this brings us back to the original question. What are game mechanics good for? If you think getting into a new gaming system is going to save your D&D game by making it better, chances are no. Everything about a D&D group or a D&D game, how successful it is, how much fun you're having, really has to do with the group that you're in. And it depends on two factors. How mature is the group, and how much are you willing to cooperate with each other to have a really, really good game. I recommend that you go look at that one shot by Matt Mercer and Critical Role. As you're watching them play using Daggerheart, you're not going to be able to tell the difference between them using mechanics for Dungeons and Dragons or their Daggerheart. Why? Because they're a fantastic group. Everybody's involved. Everybody buys into the game. Everybody respects Matt. Matt knows his stuff. And so therefore you can clearly see that the mechanics don't really matter that much. It's really about the group. My name is Don Franco 3, the Busy Person's GM. This is RPG Boons, where we talk about everything RPG and how everything is RP. Please hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, leave comments if you want to talk about some D&D or any other RPG, and I'll see you next time. In your campaign, the world should always be in chaos. There are over 40 playable races in Dungeons and Dragons. I want you to think about that. Over 40 races that can have all the same flaws, bonuses, intelligences that the standard other 8 races have. Logistically, think about how you would have to cram that many people into one world and live peacefully.